Is South Park the most morally confused show in television history, or the most morally honest one? I mean that as a real question, not rhetorical, not a setup for some clever answer I've already decided on. I'm genuinely asking, because after spending what I can only describe as an unreasonable number of hours rewatching episodes, reading interviews, and sitting with the uncomfortable parts of this show, the parts that made me cringe, the parts that made me angry, the parts I used to laugh at, and now I'm not sure I should have. I still don't have a clean answer. And I think that's the point. I think the fact that I can't settle on an answer might be the most South Park thing about South Park. Here's what I mean. This is a show that spent 20 plus years telling its audience, over and over, that the truth is always somewhere in the middle, that both sides are usually wrong, that caring too much about anything makes you a sucker. And for a long time, a lot of people, me included, thought that was wisdom. We thought Parker and Stone had cracked some kind of code. They weren't left. They weren't right. They were just honest. They saw through the bullshit on every side, and they had the guts to say so. But here's the thing. Nobody wants to talk about. Sometimes the middle isn't where the truth lives. Sometimes one side really is more right than the other. And sometimes, when you build your entire worldview around the idea that everyone's equally stupid, you end up being the one who's wrong. And South Park, this show that I love, this show that I think is one of the greatest comedic achievements in television history, has been wrong. Not occasionally. Not in minor, forgivable ways. Genuinely, consequentially, morally wrong. About things that mattered. About things that hurt real people. Tonight, we're going to talk about that. All of it. The climate change denial. The transgender episodes that range from uncomfortable to outright cruel. The both sides centrism that flattened real moral distinctions into punchlines. The moments where going after everyone equally meant going after people who didn't deserve it and giving cover to people who absolutely did. We're going to talk about the racial caricatures that the show leaned into for years, the episodes that punched down when they thought they were punching up, and the times when South Park's proudest tradition, we make fun of everybody, was really just an excuse to avoid the harder work of figuring out who actually needed to be made fun of. But, and this is where it gets interesting, and this is why I think this video is going to be different from anything else you've seen on this topic. We're also going to talk about what happens when a show gets it wrong and then tries to get it right. Because South Park is maybe the only show in history that has gone back, looked at its own moral failures, and said, on camera, in the text of the show itself, we screwed that up. That man-bear-pig apology to Al Gore. That's not nothing. That's actually extraordinary. And I want to give that the weight it deserves while also being honest about the damage that came first. So if you're watching this late at night, settle in. This is going to be a long one, and it's not going to be comfortable. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight is going to challenge how you think about a show you probably love. I know it challenged how I think about it, but I think that's worth doing. I think South Park itself would want us to do that. If there's one thing Trey Parker and Matt Stone have always respected, it's the willingness to look at something honestly, even when it's ugly. And hey, if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button. It really does help us keep making these for you. Papertown is built on people who love South Park enough to sit with the hard questions. That's what we do here. All right, let's get into it. I want to run 2 threads through tonight's conversation, and I want to be upfront about that, because I think it's the only honest way to approach this topic. The first thread is South Park as moral failure. The specific episodes, the specific takes, the specific moments where the show got it wrong and people got hurt because of it. Real people, real consequences. That thread is going to be uncomfortable, and I'm not going to soften it. The second thread is South Park as moral reckoning. The show's capacity, rare among any form of media, to circle back and confront its own mistakes. To build self-correction into the text of the show itself. To say years later, yeah, we blew that one. These 2 threads are going to run side by side all night. And at the end, I want to see if they can be woven together into something coherent. Whether a show that gets things catastrophically wrong, but eventually owns it, is better or worse than a show that plays it safe and never takes moral risks at all. I genuinely don't know the answer. But I think the question is one of the most interesting things happening in American pop culture, and I think South Park is the only show that forces you to ask it. Let's start with the big one, the one that South Park itself eventually admitted it got wrong. Climate change, April 26th, 2006, Season 10, Episode 6, Man Bear Pig. If you're a South Park fan, You know this episode. Al Gore shows up at South Park Elementary to warn the kids about a terrible creature, half man, half bear, half pig, that threatens the entire world. The joke, obviously, is that man-bear-pig doesn't exist. Gore is portrayed as a lonely, attention-seeking loser who invented this imaginary threat because he couldn't handle losing the 2000 presidential election to George W. Bush. He drags the boys into the Cave of the Winds to hunt for this non-existent creature, nearly gets them killed in a cave-in, and then takes credit for saving them. Stan, finally fed up, yells at him, "You just use man-bear-pig as a way to get attention for yourself because you're a loser." And look, as a piece of comedy, the episode works. Trey Parker voices Gore with this perfectly irritating mix of earnestness and self-importance. The half-man, half-bear, half-pig bit, where nobody can agree on the proportions, is funny. The cave sequence has genuine tension. As a standalone 22 minutes of television, it's fine. But the subtext wasn't subtle. Man-bear-pig was climate change. Al Gore was Al Gore. And the message was clear. This guy is making up a problem that doesn't exist to feed his own ego. And anyone who takes him seriously is being played. This episode aired 1 month before Gore released An Inconvenient Truth. 1 month. The documentary that would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 2007. The film that, whatever you think of its specific predictions, brought the reality of climate change into mainstream American conversation in a way nothing else had. And South Park was out there telling millions of viewers, particularly young male viewers, the show's core demographic, many of whom were forming their political worldviews in real time, that the whole thing was a joke, that the guy warning them was a pathetic narcissist, that the threat wasn't real. I need to sit with this for a second because it's easy to minimize. It's easy to say, well, it's just a cartoon. And you know what? Maybe that would be true if South Park were just a cartoon. But it's not. This is a show that has shaped how an entire generation thinks about politics, culture, and public discourse. Studies have been written about the South Park effect, the measurable influence the show has had on political attitudes among young Americans. The show's libertarian leaning, "both sides are stupid" worldview didn't just reflect how people thought, it helped create how people thought. So when South Park told its audience that climate change was an invention of a desperate politician, that wasn't just a joke. That was a position. And it was wrong. And here's what gets me. It wasn't even a one-off. Before Man Bear Pig, there was 2 Days Before the Day After Tomorrow in Season 9, which aired on October 19th, 2005. In that episode, Stan and Cartman accidentally break the world's largest beaver dam, flooding the nearby town of Beaverton. But instead of taking responsibility, the adults of South Park panic about global warming, treating it as a hoax, a distraction, something people use to avoid dealing with real problems. The rednecks blame Osama bin Laden. The government blames the crab people. Meanwhile, the actual cause is just 2 kids being careless, and the adults are too busy with their narratives to notice. The message, again, is that concern about global warming is performative panic, that the people who talk about it are avoiding real problems, that the threat is manufactured. And then several months later, Season 10 brought us Smug Alert, which aired on March 29th, 2006. This one goes after hybrid car owners. Gerald Broflovsky buys a Prius and becomes so insufferably self-righteous about it that he moves his family to San Francisco, which South Park depicts as a city so choked with its own smug self-satisfaction that people literally smell their own farts. The episode even coins the concept of smug as a form of pollution, worse than actual smog, because at least smog doesn't come with a superiority complex. And okay, the joke about San Francisco is funny. I'll give them that. The image of George Clooney's Oscar acceptance speech generating a massive cloud of smug is objectively hilarious. But the underlying argument that environmentalism is fundamentally a form of vanity, that caring about emissions is really just a way of feeling better than other people, did real damage. It stigmatized hybrid cars. It made environmentally conscious choices look uncool and pretentious to a generation of viewers who were exactly the people who needed to be making those choices. This is the first thread. This is South Park as moral failure. 3 episodes across 2 seasons that collectively told millions of viewers that climate change wasn't real, that the people warning about it were idiots, and that caring about the environment was just a sophisticated form of narcissism. Now here's where the second thread begins, because 12 years later, something remarkable happened. November 7th, 2018, Season 22, Episode 6. Time to get cereal. Man Bear Pig is back, but this time, Man Bear Pig is real. Horrifyingly, undeniably, violently real. The creature starts rampaging through South Park, killing people, destroying property, and the boys, who dismissed Gore all those years ago, realize they need his help. But Gore doesn't just jump in to save them. He wants something first. He wants an apology, and not just any apology, a sincere one, a serial one. And the boys have to grovel. They have to admit that they made fun of him, that they didn't take him seriously, and that he was right all along. I remember watching this episode and feeling something I don't think I've ever felt watching a comedy show before. I felt like the show itself was apologizing, not just to Al Gore the character, to Al Gore the person, to everyone who had tried to sound the alarm about climate change and been laughed at, partly because of South Park, partly because this show, with its massive cultural influence, had told its audience that caring about the planet was for losers. The following week, Nobody Got Cereal, Season 22, Episode 7, November 14th, 2018, doubled down on the correction. There's this scene in a restaurant where a man is sitting with his wife, smugly explaining why Man Bear Pig can't possibly be real. And right behind him, Man Bear Pig bursts through the window and starts killing everyone. As the carnage unfolds literally behind his back, the man keeps finding new reasons to deny it. Okay, Man Bear Pig is real, but what are we going to do about it at this point? And just as he starts blaming China, Man Bear Pig devours him. That scene is directed at every climate change denier, and it's directed at Parker and Stone's past selves. The smug denier in the restaurant is who they used to be, and they killed him. Al Gore himself addressed the episodes during an appearance on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. He called it a hell of a statement for the show to admit it had been wrong, and he was gracious about it. He didn't rub it in. He acknowledged that it takes courage to publicly reverse yourself, especially when you've been as loud and influential as South Park. And I think Gore is right. It does take courage. And I want to give Parker and Stone genuine credit for doing something that almost nobody in the public eye ever does, admitting in their own work that they were wrong about something fundamental. That's rare. That's important. But I also can't let it erase what came before. 12 years. Man Bear Pig aired in 2006. Time to Get Cereal aired in 2018. That's 12 years during which one of the most influential comedy shows in America was, at best, silent on climate change, and at worst, actively contributing to a culture of denial. 12 years during which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published multiple reports documenting accelerating warming. 12 years during which Arctic ice retreated, sea levels rose, and extreme weather events became more frequent and more severe. 12 years during which the window for meaningful action narrowed. Did South Park cause climate change denial? Obviously not. But did South Park make it cooler to not care? Did it give young people a framework, caring is lame, skepticism is smart, that made it easier to disengage from the most important issue of their lifetime? I think it did, and I think that matters. So hold those two threads. Climate change. South Park, morally wrong for 12 years, then morally courageous in a way almost no other show has managed. Both things are true. Both things matter, and the tension between them is going to define everything else we talk about tonight. Okay. Let's go somewhere harder, because climate change is a topic where there's now such overwhelming scientific consensus that admitting you were wrong is, while admirable, also relatively low risk. You're aligning yourself with reality. The harder test of a show's moral compass is what it does with questions that are genuinely contested, genuinely divisive, and genuinely about real people's lives and identities. Which brings us to South Park and transgender people. I've been going back and forth about how to approach this section because I want to be fair. I want to be fair to the show. I want to be fair to the trans community. And I want to be fair to the complexity of these episodes. But I also think that fairness, in this case, means being honest about what these episodes actually say and what impact they've had. So here goes. March 9th, 2005, Season 9, Episode 1. Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina. This is the season premiere, the very first episode of Season 9. And it opens with real surgical footage of gender-affirming surgery, actual medical footage, spliced into the animated show, presented as grotesque, as shocking, as something the viewer is supposed to recoil from. Now, the show's defenders will tell you that South Park uses shock value all the time, and that's true. But there's a difference between shocking the audience with an absurd cartoon scenario and showing real medical footage of a procedure that, for many people, is a profoundly important, life-affirming step. The framing isn't neutral. The surgery isn't presented as medicine. It's presented as mutilation, as something inherently horrifying and ridiculous. After the surgery, Mrs. Garrison, who is presented as still looking exactly like a bald man, just now wearing a dress, struts around South Park announcing herself as a woman. The joke is that she obviously isn't one. Not in the show's framing. The show treats her transition as self-delusion. And then the episode makes its real argument. Kyle decides he wants to be tall and black so he can play basketball. So he gets a negroplasty, a surgery to become African American. And Gerald, Kyle's dad, decides he wants to be a dolphin. So he gets a dolphinoplasty. The parallel is the argument. The episode is saying, explicitly, that a person transitioning gender is equivalent to a white kid wanting to become black, or a man wanting to become a dolphin. That all three are equally delusional. That all three involve denying your fundamental nature and mutilating your body to pursue an impossible fantasy. I know there are people listening to this right now who are going to say, but it's just a joke. And I hear you. I do. But this is a joke that has a thesis. And the thesis is that transgender people aren't really the gender they say they are. That transition is a delusion. That the appropriate response is to mock the procedure, mock the person, and equate the whole thing with wanting to be a different species. This episode aired in 2005. That's 21 years ago now. And in 2005, the cultural conversation about transgender identity was profoundly different from what it is today. Visibility was lower, understanding was thinner. And South Park, which millions of young people watched as their primary source of cultural commentary, was telling them that trans people were a punchline. I've been thinking a lot about a line from that episode. Mrs. Garrison, after learning she can't get pregnant or have a period, says, "This would mean I'm not really a woman. I'm just a guy with a mutilated penis. You made me into a freak." That line, that specific line. I want you to think about what it means to hear that if you're a trans woman, if you've undergone or are considering gender-affirming surgery. One of the most popular shows on television just put words in a character's mouth that describe your experience as mutilation and your identity as a fraud. And millions of people laughed. Look, I've rewatched this episode 3 times putting this script together, and each time I noticed something different about my own reaction. The first time, I was focused on the comedy. And yeah, some of the sight gags are objectively well constructed. Parker knows how to build a comedic sequence. The second time, I was focused on the argument, and it made me increasingly uncomfortable. The third time, I couldn't stop thinking about the person watching this who was maybe 15, maybe questioning their own identity, and who just received the message that what they're feeling is equivalent to wanting to be a dolphin. And South Park went back to this well, again and again. Season 11, 2007. Yikes! Mrs. Garrison discovers she's attracted to women, leading to an episode about a lesbian bar that leans into every tired stereotype about what lesbians do in bed. Season 12, 2008. Penis. Garrison transitions back to male, proudly declaring himself a man again, treating the entire journey of transition and detransition as a sitcom subplot. The show spent 3 seasons treating a transgender identity as a costume that could be put on and taken off, motivated by shallow impulses rather than genuine self-understanding. Then there's The Sissy in season 18, which aired on October 8th, 2014. And I actually want to give this episode more nuanced consideration, because something interesting happened here. Cartman puts on a pink bow and declares himself transgender, so he can use the girls' bathroom. The obvious joke is that Cartman is faking it, exploiting trans identity for personal convenience, and that is offensive on its own. The idea that trans identity is something people fake for access or advantage is one of the most common and damaging myths about transgender people. But the episode also has Stan's subplot. Randy has been secretly living as Lord, the pop star, using the women's bathroom at work and singing to himself. And by the end of the episode, the school votes to let anyone use whichever bathroom they're comfortable with. Randy's wife encourages him to be himself. The message, buried under the Cartman stuff, is actually weirdly progressive, not caring about who uses which bathroom is presented as the normal, mature response. The people who are upset about it are sissies. So what do you do with an episode that simultaneously reinforces harmful stereotypes about trans people faking it and arrives at a genuinely progressive conclusion about bathroom access? That's the puzzle. That's the thing South Park does that drives people crazy. It holds contradictory moral positions within the same 22 minutes and dares you to figure out which one it really means. But then, November 13th, 2019, Season 23, Episode 7, Bored Girls. And whatever goodwill the sissy might have built evaporates. In this episode, a character named Heather Swanson, a clear parody of Macho Man Randy Savage, huge muscles, deep voice, dark beard, enters a women's athletic competition after identifying as a woman 2 weeks earlier. She dominates every event. The supposed joke is that a person who is obviously, visibly, a man is competing against women and winning because no one is allowed to question her identity. The episode was almost universally condemned. Den of Geek gave it 3 out of 5 stars and called its handling of transgender athletes irresponsible and sloppy. Multiple LGBTQ publications denounced it as transphobic. And the reason is clear. The episode takes the most extreme, most bad faith version of the transgender athletes debate and presents it as representative. Heather Swanson isn't a trans woman. She's explicitly an ex-boyfriend who is lying about being trans to dominate women's sports and humiliate his ex-girlfriend. The joke is that everyone around her is too scared by political correctness to say the obvious, that she's a man. This is punching down. This is taking a vulnerable community that faces disproportionate rates of violence, discrimination, and suicide, and using them as the punchline for a joke about political correctness gone mad. And it's doing it in a way that directly feeds the rhetoric used to discriminate against real transgender athletes, real people, many of them teenagers, who just want to play sports. And unlike climate change, there has been no man-bear-pig style correction, no time to get cereal for transgender issues, no episode where the boys go back to Mrs. Garrison and say, "We were wrong about you." Parker and Stone have never, to my knowledge, publicly expressed regret about any of their transgender episodes. This is where the two threads diverge. On climate change, South Park eventually reached its own moral reckoning. On transgender issues, the reckoning hasn't come, and I don't know if it ever will. Let me take a step back here and talk about the philosophy underneath all of this, because I think it's the key to understanding why South Park gets things wrong in the specific way that it does. There's a concept in political philosophy called false equivalence. It's the idea that presenting two positions as equally valid when they aren't actually equally supported by evidence or moral reasoning creates a distorted picture of reality. And South Park, I love this show. I need to keep saying that because I want you to know this isn't a hit piece. South Park has built its entire worldview on a form of false equivalence. The most distilled version of this is Douche and Turd, Season 8, Episode 8, which aired on October 27, 2004, 1 week before the presidential election between George W. Bush and John Kerry. The episode's central premise is that every election is a choice between a giant douche and a turd sandwich, that both candidates are always equally terrible, that the system itself is rigged to produce only bad options, and that anyone who gets passionate about either side is a sucker. As comedy, it's perfect. The episode is sharp, funny, and quotable. Nearly every election since the beginning of time has been between some douche and some turd. They're the only people who suck up enough to make it that far in politics. I've heard people quote that line unironically for 20 years. But here's the problem. Elections have consequences. Real consequences. The 2004 election determined the trajectory of the Iraq War, the response to Hurricane Katrina, Supreme Court appointments, and climate policy. The differences between Bush and Kerry were not trivial. They were not equivalent. And telling millions of young viewers that voting is inherently pointless because all candidates are equally bad isn't just cynicism, it's a civic disservice. The same logic runs through I'm a Little Bit Country, Season 7, Episode 4, April 9th, 2003, where the show's take on the Iraq War is that both the pro-war and anti-war sides are correct. The Hawks provide security, the Doves provide moral credibility, and together they make America work. It's a clever bit of intellectual aikido. It sounds wise, but it's also a way of avoiding the harder question. Was the war justified? Were the intelligence claims about weapons of mass destruction accurate? Did the people who opposed the invasion have a better grasp of reality than the people who supported it? History has been pretty clear on those questions. There were no weapons of mass destruction. The war cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The anti-war movement was, on the fundamental question of whether the invasion was necessary, correct. But South Park's both sidesism gave viewers permission to opt out of that moral accounting. Both sides had a point. Everyone's a little bit right and a little bit wrong. Don't get too worked up about it. I think about this a lot. I think about the millions of people who absorbed South Park's political philosophy during their formative years. The idea that passion is foolish, that conviction is for suckers, that the smartest position is always to stand back and laugh at everyone who cares. And I wonder what that did to an entire generation's capacity for civic engagement. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have been described as libertarian, though they resist the label. In a 2016 interview, Stone said they believe in liberty. Parker said if he thought there was any chance in hell that Gary Johnson could win, he'd probably support him. These are their politics, a deep suspicion of all institutions, all ideologies, all collective action, a belief that the individual should be left alone, and that anyone trying to organize you into a group, left or right, conservative or progressive, is probably trying to manipulate you. As a comedic lens, that's incredibly productive. It lets you satirize everything. It means nothing is sacred. It's why South Park can do an episode about Scientology, and an episode about environmentalism, and an episode about the Catholic Church, and an episode about atheism, and all of them are devastating. When you believe everyone is full of it, you can find the hypocrisy everywhere. But as a moral philosophy, it has a blind spot the size of a continent. Because sometimes people aren't full of it. Sometimes the people yelling about a problem are yelling because the problem is real. And when your default setting is anyone who cares this much is probably wrong, you're going to miss the moments when they're right. That's what happened with climate change. Al Gore cared too much, so he must be wrong. That's what happened with transgender rights. Trans activists care too much, so there must be something ridiculous about their position. That's the pattern. South Park's bullshit detector is incredibly sensitive, but it can't distinguish between genuine bullshit and genuine conviction. To the show's worldview, they look the same. Now, here's where I want to pick up the second thread again, because there's another side to this coin, and I think it's equally important. South Park has also been morally right in ways that very few other shows have managed, and it's been morally right precisely because of the same qualities that make it morally wrong. With apologies to Jesse Jackson, Season 11, Episode 1, March 7th, 2007. This is one of the best episodes of television ever made about race in America, and it almost never gets the credit it deserves in these conversations. Randy goes on Wheel of Fortune. The category is people who annoy you. The letters spell out N_GGERS. And Randy, on live television, says the word everyone's thinking. Not the answer, naggers, but the racial slur. Now, a lesser show would have used this as an excuse for a racial comedy that ultimately lets the white character off the hook. He didn't mean it. It was an honest mistake. And for the first half of the episode, it looks like that might be where South Park is going. Randy tries to apologize. He goes to Jesse Jackson. He kisses Jesse Jackson's behind, literally. He assumes the apology fixes everything. But then, there's Stan and Tolkien. Stan keeps trying to tell Tolkien that it's not a big deal, that his dad isn't racist, just stupid, that they should move on. And Tolkien keeps pushing back. You don't understand, and you shouldn't say it's not a big deal. And here's the moment that elevates this episode from good to extraordinary. At the end, Stan doesn't come around. He doesn't have an epiphany where he suddenly gets it. Instead, what he gets is that he doesn't get it. That as a white kid, he will never fully understand what that word means to a black person. And that acknowledging that gap, saying, I don't get it, and I'm not going to pretend I do, is the most honest and respectful thing he can do. The NAACP praised this episode, called it a good example of educating the public on the power of hate words and their impact. And the episode was written in response to the Michael Richards incident at the Laugh Factory in November 2006, where Richards screamed racial slurs at black audience members. Parker and Stone's writer's room included Vernon Chapman, who is biracial, and Chapman was particularly outraged by Richards' apology to Jesse Jackson, which inspired Tolkien's line, Jesse Jackson is not the emperor of black people. This is South Park at its moral best, using crude humor and absurd situations to arrive at a genuinely insightful conclusion about race, empathy, and the limits of white understanding. An episode that uses the most offensive word in the English language more times than you can count, and comes out the other side having said something more honest about racism than most prestige dramas manage. And that's the thing that makes this show so maddening, so impossible to categorize, so resistant to simple moral judgments. The same show that equated transgender identity with wanting to be a dolphin also produced one of the most thoughtful explorations of racial empathy in TV history. The same creators who denied climate change for 12 years also produced a retraction so genuine that the person they'd mocked praised their courage. The same worldview that produces false equivalence also produces a kind of radical honesty that more responsible shows are too careful to attempt. I think about Trapped in the Closet, Season 9, Episode 12, November 16th, 2005. The Scientology episode. Stan takes a free personality test, scores absurdly high thetan levels, and is declared the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard. Tom Cruise locks himself in Stan's closet. Tom Cruise won't come out of the closet and refuses to leave. The episode lays out the entire Xenu origin story with the chyron, "This is what Scientologists actually believe," running across the bottom of the screen. Everything in that episode about Scientology's beliefs is accurate. Parker and Stone did their research. Every detail about the Thetans, the volcanoes, the alien ruler Xenu, the frozen aliens, all of it is what the Church of Scientology actually teaches at its upper levels. And the episode exposed these beliefs to a massive audience, many of whom had no idea what Scientology's inner teachings looked like. The Church of Scientology went after Parker and Stone hard. A leaked internal document from the Church's Office of Special Affairs revealed they conducted an extensive investigation of the creators, tracking their cars, their parking spaces, their catering service. Isaac Hayes, who voiced Chef and was a practicing Scientologist, quit the show, though his son later revealed in 2016 that Hayes had suffered a stroke, and the decision was likely made by Scientologist associates on his behalf. Comedy Central pulled a planned rebroadcast of the episode in March 2006, allegedly under pressure from Tom Cruise, who was about to promote Mission Impossible 3 through Paramount, which shared a parent company with Comedy Central. Parker responded in an interview, "Tom Cruise has done more for South Park than anyone I think in the world. This is South Park being morally courageous, taking on a powerful, litigious, vindictive organization, and refusing to back down." When the Church tried to silence them, Parker and Stone released a statement identifying themselves as servants of the Dark Lord Xenu. They credited every person in the episode as either John Smith or Jane Smith to preempt lawsuits. They treated the intimidation as fuel. Was the episode morally right? Absolutely. Scientology exploits its members financially and psychologically. Its practices of disconnection have destroyed families. Its leadership has been accused of horrific abuses. Exposing its inner workings to a mass audience was a public service disguised as comedy. But here's the complication, and this is why I keep running these two threads. The same fearlessness that let them take on Scientology is the same fearlessness that let them go after trans people. The same nothing is sacred philosophy that exposed Xenu also produced Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina. You can't separate the courage from the cruelty. They come from the same place. This is what makes South Park a genuinely difficult moral case. It's not a show that's consistently wrong. It's not a show that's consistently right. It's a show that swings wildly between moral brilliance and moral catastrophe, and the same engine powers both. The willingness to say anything, to go anywhere, to refuse all sacred cows. That's what lets South Park be the bravest show on television and the most irresponsible show on television, sometimes in the same season, sometimes in the same episode. I want to talk about race now, because South Park's relationship with racial comedy is another place where these two threads intertwine in ways that I find genuinely confusing. There's Tuong Lu Kim, the owner of City Walk, a character who speaks in an exaggerated Asian accent, constantly mispronouncing city as a homophone for a profanity, a walking stereotype who has appeared in multiple episodes across multiple seasons. Now, South Park's defenders will point out that in Season 15's City Sushi, which aired on June 1st, 2011, the show revealed that Tuong Lu Kim is actually a white man named Dr. William Janus, with dissociative identity disorder. Lou Kim is one of his alternate personalities. The real person behind the Asian stereotype is a white guy whose fractured psyche created the caricature. It's South Park's way of saying, the racist caricature isn't a real Asian person. It's a white person's imagination of what an Asian person is. And that's clever. I'll give them that. It's a genuinely interesting meta-commentary on racial stereotyping. The show is acknowledging that the character is a stereotype by revealing the stereotype to be a white fabrication. But here's the thing. They had been doing the joke straight for years before the reveal. Tuong Lou Kim appeared in Jared Has AIDS in Season 6. 2002. That's 9 years of a broadly racist caricature before the "it was meta-commentary all along" explanation. 9 years during which the joke was simply, haha, the Asian guy talks funny. And even after the reveal, the show kept using Lou Kim for the same type of humor. The explanation didn't change the joke. It just gave the joke a layer of intellectual deniability. This is a pattern I see over and over with South Park's approach to race. The show creates racial humor that would be straightforwardly offensive on any other show, then adds a metatextual layer, a twist, a subversion, a hidden commentary that allows defenders to argue it's actually critiquing the racism rather than perpetuating it. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's just a fig leaf. Think about Butter's very own episode, Season 5, Episode 14, December 12th, 2001. A genuinely dark, genuinely funny episode about Butter's father's secret homosexual affairs and his mother's attempted murder of Butters by driving into a river. At the end, the parents join a support group with O.J. Simpson, John and Patricia Ramsey, and Congressman Gary Condit, people who were suspected of involvement in crimes but never convicted. Parker and Stone later said in a 2011 interview that they regretted throwing the Ramseys and Condit under the suspicion bus. The Ramseys were never indicted, and the key witness in the Condit case later admitted to falsifying testimony. By grouping them with O.J. Simpson in a club of people who got away with it, the show was implying guilt where none had been legally established. This is a small example, but it illustrates something important. South Park makes bold moral claims through comedy. This person is guilty. This ideology is stupid. This group is ridiculous. And those claims have impact precisely because the show is so popular and so trusted as a voice of honest skepticism. When South Park says something, people take it as a kind of truth. Not literal truth, but a distilled version of what everyone's really thinking. And when what everyone's really thinking turns out to be wrong, the damage is real. And I think there's a broader conversation to be had about South Park and religion, because the show has always positioned itself as an equal opportunity offender when it comes to faith. But there are some genuine moral questions embedded in that stance that I don't think get examined enough. Bloody Mary, Season 9, Episode 14, December 7th, 2005, the season finale. And I need you to know the air date, because December 7th is the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, a Catholic holy day specifically devoted to the Virgin Mary. That's the day Comedy Central chose to broadcast an episode in which a statue of the Virgin Mary starts bleeding from her rear end, and Pope Benedict XVI declares it's not a miracle because the blood is actually coming from her vagina. And I'm going to use the show's own phrasing, chicks bleed out their vaginas all the time. The Catholic League went ballistic. Bill Donahue called it an appalling and disgusting portrayal of the Virgin Mary. Bishop William Skillstad, president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, sent a formal letter to Viacom. When Comedy Central rebroadcast all of Season 9 on December 28th, Bloody Mary was conspicuously absent from the lineup. In New Zealand, Catholic bishops lobbied media company CanWest to prevent the episode from airing. CanWest refused and actually moved the broadcast up to capitalize on the publicity. The episode drew 210,000 viewers in the UK alone, 6 times the network's usual South Park audience, and achieved a 41% share among 18 to 29-year-olds. Now here's the thing. The episode's actual point isn't really about the Virgin Mary. It's about Alcoholics Anonymous and the disease model of addiction. Randy gets a DUI, goes to AA, becomes convinced his drinking is a disease he's powerless over, and seeks a miracle cure rather than taking personal responsibility. Stan ultimately tells his dad that true discipline is moderation. Parker even said in the DVD commentary that Randy's DUI arrest was based on a nearly identical experience he had with his own father when he was 9 years old. There's something personal and honest underneath the shock. But the Virgin Mary bit, the bleeding, the Pope inspecting it, that's where the moral question gets interesting. Because there's a difference between satirizing a cultural phenomenon, miracle cures, religious tourism, the commodification of faith, and deliberately choosing the eve of a Catholic holy day to broadcast an image designed to be maximally offensive to Catholic viewers. The first is satire. The second is trolling. And I think Bloody Mary is both simultaneously. And I think Parker and Stone either didn't know the difference or didn't care. And this is a pattern that runs through South Park's religious satire. The show goes after Scientology, and that's punching up at a powerful, litigious organization that exploits its members. The show goes after Catholicism, and that's punching at a faith tradition followed by over 1 billion people, many of them genuinely nourished by their devotion to Mary. The show goes after Mormonism in All About Mormons, Season 7, Episode 12, November 19th, 2003, and actually ends with the Mormon kid telling Stan off for being a judgmental jerk, which is one of the show's most surprising and morally generous conclusions. I'm not saying religion should be off limits. I absolutely don't believe that. But the moral weight of religious satire depends on who's being targeted, what power they hold, and what the real-world consequences are for the people being mocked. Mocking Tom Cruise for Scientology doesn't carry the same weight as mocking a tradition that 1 billion people find sacred. The punch lands differently depending on who's catching it. I want to spend a minute on the Cartoon Wars episodes, Season 10, Episodes 3 and 4, April 5th and 12th, 2006, because they represent South Park at its most principled and its most self-serving simultaneously. Family Guy is going to air an uncensored image of Muhammad. Kyle argues for free speech. Cartman wants Family Guy canceled, not for principled reasons. He just hates the show. The real kicker is that Comedy Central actually censored the South Park depiction of Muhammad in the episode. Parker and Stone wanted to show Muhammad, but the network blacked the image out. Their response was a title card reading that Comedy Central refused to broadcast the image. This is genuinely brave about free speech. Standing up against violent intimidation matters. But is it possible to be right about the principle and wrong about the execution? Is it possible that the abstract right to depict Muhammad doesn't automatically mean it's wise or compassionate to do so? Especially when the people who face real-world consequences aren't wealthy creators of a hit show, but ordinary Muslims who navigate increased hostility every time these debates flare up. I don't have a clean answer. But South Park's free speech absolutism sometimes functions as a way of avoiding the harder question of what you should say, as opposed to what you're allowed to say. The right to offend everyone is real. The wisdom of offending everyone is a separate question entirely. There's another area I want to touch on that I've never seen anyone discuss in depth in the context of South Park's moral record. Disability. Crazy Cripples. Season 7, Episode 2, March 26th, 2003. Jimmy and Timmy start a club for people born with disabilities. The B-plot has Christopher Reeve consuming human fetuses to gain Superman-like powers, eventually becoming a supervillain. The real Christopher Reeve, a quadriplegic, an advocate for stem cell research, is presented as monstrously selfish, gaining literal superpowers by devouring the unborn, while everyone calls him inspirational. Reeve died on October 10th, 2004, less than 19 months later. The episode didn't cause his death, obviously, but watching it after his death carries a completely different weight. The show mocked a man's disability, his advocacy, his attempts to fund spinal cord research, and then he died. And the mockery lives forever in reruns and streams, carrying its cruelty into a future where the target can never respond. Now, I think the show's broader treatment of disability through Jimmy and Timmy is actually quite good. They're real characters with real storylines and real flaws. They're not inspirational props. South Park, more than most shows, treats its disabled characters as fully realized human beings. But Crazy Cripples shows the limits of we make fun of everybody. When you mock a quadriplegic man's attempts to fund research that might help him walk again, and you do it by imagining him as a fetus-devouring monster, you're not making fun of everybody. You're making fun of one specific vulnerable person. And the shield of equal opportunity offense doesn't protect you from the moral weight of that choice. There's a concept in comedy theory called the superiority theory of humor. Goes back to Plato and Aristotle. The basic idea is that we laugh at things that make us feel superior. We laugh at people falling because we're not falling. We laugh at stupidity because we feel smart by comparison. South Park weaponizes this instinct better than almost any show in history. When you laugh at Al Gore in Man Bear Pig, you're positioned as smarter than Gore. When you laugh at Mrs. Garrison, you're positioned as more grounded in reality. When you laugh at the douche and the turd, you're positioned as smarter than the people who take voting seriously. The problem with superiority humor is that it requires someone to be inferior. Someone has to be the butt. And when the butt is a powerful institution, Scientology, the Catholic Church, the superiority feels earned. When the butt is a vulnerable person, a trans woman, a quadriplegic advocate, a climate scientist trying to save the planet, the superiority is just cruelty with a punchline. South Park doesn't always make this distinction. The show's operating principle, everything is equally mockable, prevents the moral calculation that says this person deserves to be mocked and this person doesn't. Making that calculation requires admitting that not all targets are equal, and admitting that would undermine the show's entire worldview. This is the deepest moral flaw in South Park's philosophy. Not any individual episode, not any specific take, but the foundational premise that all targets are equivalent, that power dynamics don't matter, that punching up and punching down are the same thing because the punch itself is what matters. That premise is wrong. Power dynamics do matter. Context matters. And we go after everyone doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to consider who gets hurt. I want to take a moment here. We've been going for a while, and if you're still with me, I genuinely appreciate it. This is one of those videos where I went in thinking I knew what I wanted to say, and the deeper I got, the more complicated it became. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just a video about a cartoon show. Let me take a different angle. I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about South Park's moral failures, the show's relationship with its own audience. Here's something I've noticed after years of watching this show and watching people react to this show. South Park has created a specific type of viewer, a person who uses the show's rhetoric as a license to not care about anything: climate change, Man Bear Pig, transgender rights, Mr. Garrison, political engagement, giant douche and turd sandwich. For every issue that matters, South Park has provided a ready-made reference point for dismissal, and I don't think Parker and Stone intended that. I genuinely don't. I think they see themselves as skeptics, not nihilists. I think they believe in questioning everything, not in dismissing everything. But the effect of their work, the downstream cultural effect, has often been nihilistic. It's given people permission to opt out, to treat every moral question as a joke, to see every passionate person as a mark, to be the guy at the party who's too smart to care about anything. I've been that guy. I need to say that honestly. In my 20s, I used South Park references as a substitute for political engagement. I said, both sides are the same. And I said, I just believe in liberty. And I thought I was being clever, when really, I was being lazy. And I think a lot of people in my generation had the same experience. South Park made us feel smart for not caring. And not caring, it turns out, is not a moral position. It's the absence of one. But, and this is the other thread, the redemption thread. And I keep coming back to it because I think it's essential. South Park has also, at its best, been the thing that made people start caring. With apologies to Jesse Jackson, made people think about the N-word in ways they hadn't before. Trapped in the Closet made people aware of Scientology's abuses. The Man Bear Pig correction made people reconsider their own dismissiveness about climate change. When South Park decides to use its power for genuine moral exploration rather than cynical deflection, the results can be transformative. Dead Kids, Season 22, Episode 1, September 26th, 2018. This is the school shooting episode, and I think it might be the most morally complex thing the show has ever done. The premise is simple and devastating. There are multiple school shootings at South Park Elementary over the course of the episode. Children are shot, a SWAT team storms a classroom, and nobody cares. Not the kids, not the teachers, not the parents, not the town. The shootings are treated as background noise, less important than Cartman's math test, less urgent than Randy's concern about Sharon's emotional state. The only person who reacts with appropriate horror is Sharon Marsh. She's distraught. She's angry. She can't understand why nobody else seems to care that children are being shot in their school. And the running joke, and this is where the show's cruelty becomes its compassion, is that everyone around her attributes her concern to her period. Randy asks if she's on her period. The other parents suggest she might be going through menopause. The implication is that only hormonal imbalance could explain a person having a normal human reaction to children being murdered. By the end of the episode, Sharon has been worn down. She stops caring. She adjusts. She becomes as numb as everyone else. And then she gets a phone call. Stan has been shot, and she barely reacts. That's the joke. That's the horror. That's South Park holding up a mirror and saying, "This is you. This is America." You've been told to care about school shootings so many times that you can't feel it anymore. The alarm has been ringing so long that it's become silence. Is this episode morally right? Yes, unambiguously. It's a devastating critique of American gun culture and the normalization of mass violence. It's the show using its tools, absurdity, cruelty, shock, in service of a genuine moral argument. Children are dying, and we've stopped caring. And the fact that we've stopped caring is itself a form of violence. But here's where my two threads collide in a way I find really uncomfortable. The same show that produced Dead Kids, a pointed, angry episode about a specific American moral failure, also produced Douche and Turd, which told the same audience that political engagement is pointless. You can't simultaneously tell people that their apathy about gun violence is monstrous, and also tell them that caring about politics is for suckers. Those two messages cancel each other out. If voting is a choice between a douche and a turd, then what mechanism is supposed to address the gun epidemic? Thoughts and prayers? South Park has mocked those too. This is the fundamental contradiction at the heart of South Park's morality. The show is brilliant at identifying problems. It is terrible at suggesting solutions. And when it tells its audience that all solutions are equally stupid, it creates the very apathy it later condemns. I want to talk about something that I've been thinking about a lot as I put this script together. The question of whether artistic freedom and moral responsibility can coexist. Because that's really what we're talking about here. Parker and Stone have always argued, and their fans have always argued, that comedy should be free, that nothing should be off limits, that the moment you start policing what jokes are acceptable, you've lost something essential about what makes comedy work. And I understand that argument. I believe in it, to a point. But freedom and responsibility aren't opposites. They're companions. The freedom to say anything comes with the responsibility to reckon with the consequences of what you've said. And South Park, for much of its run, has enjoyed the freedom while dodging the responsibility. When the show mocked climate activists and those activists' work became harder, South Park didn't have to deal with the consequences. When the show mocked trans people and trans kids felt more isolated, South Park didn't have to deal with the consequences. When the show told young people that both political parties are identical and voter turnout among millennials remained dismally low, South Park didn't have to deal with the consequences. The people who dealt with the consequences were the activists, the trans kids, and the non-voters who woke up to a world shaped by elections they'd sat out. I know this sounds like I'm being hard on a cartoon, and I am, because South Park isn't just a cartoon. It's a cultural institution that has shaped how tens of millions of people think about the world. And cultural institutions have responsibilities, whether they want them or not. But here's where I pull back a little, because I don't want this to become a simple prosecution. I've spent a lot of time talking about what South Park gets wrong. I want to spend some time on why the things it gets wrong are, in a strange way, valuable. Here's my theory, and this is the kind of thing I think about at 3 a.m. when I've been rewatching too many episodes and I can't sleep. South Park's moral failures are, paradoxically, what make its moral successes possible. The show's willingness to be wrong, deeply, publicly, consequentially wrong, is what gives its corrections weight. When South Park apologized for Man Bear Pig, it mattered precisely because South Park never apologizes. When South Park got the N-word episode right, it mattered precisely because the show had spent years doing racial humor that walked right up to the line and sometimes crossed it. The show's moral authority, such as it is, comes not from being consistently correct, but from being consistently honest, including honestly wrong. Compare South Park to a show that carefully focus groups every position, that runs every joke through a sensitivity read, that makes sure every episode lands on the right side of every issue. That show might never offend anyone, but it would also never surprise anyone. It would never force anyone to reconsider what they thought. It would never produce a moment like the Man-Bear-Pig correction, where an audience collectively thinks, wait, if they were wrong about this, what else have they been wrong about? What else have I been wrong about? That's the bargain South Park offers. You get the cruelty along with the compassion. You get the blind spots along with the insights. You get Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina in the same body of work as with apologies to Jesse Jackson. And the question that I keep circling back to, the question that I opened this video with and still can't answer, is whether that bargain is worth it. I've been doing this a long time now. Not this video, this relationship with South Park. I've been watching this show since I was a teenager. I've grown up with it. I've watched it through phases of my life where I thought it had all the answers, and phases where I thought it had none. I've laughed at things I'm now ashamed of laughing at. I've also been genuinely moved by things I didn't expect from a show about 4 foul-mouthed kids made of construction paper. And I think the honest answer, the answer I've arrived at after all these hours of research and rewatching and thinking, is that South Park is morally messy in the way that a real person is morally messy. Trey Parker and Matt Stone aren't evil. They're not callous. They're 2 guys from Colorado who started making a show in their 20s and kept making it into their 50s, and their moral compass has wobbled and corrected, and wobbled again over the course of nearly 30 years. The same way any real person's moral compass wobbles when they're actually engaging with the world rather than hiding from it. The difference is that most people's moral wobbling happens in private. Parker and Stone's happens on television, in front of millions of people, in 22-minute increments, every week, for decades. Let me go back to a few more episodes, because I don't think we've gone deep enough yet. I want to talk about Scott Tenorman Must Die, Season 5, Episode 4, July 11th, 2001. I know. Everyone talks about this episode, but I want to talk about it in the context of what we've been discussing tonight, because I think it reveals something crucial about South Park's moral operating system. This is the episode where Cartman feeds Scott Tenorman's parents to him in Chile. Let me just say that again. An 8-year-old arranges for 2 adult human beings to be killed by a rancher, has their bodies ground into chili, and then feeds that chili to their son while licking the tears off his face. And it's played as a triumph. That's the thing people forget about Scott Tenorman Must Die. It's not framed as a horror. It's framed as Cartman's greatest victory. The audience is meant to feel, and if we're honest, does feel, a kind of satisfaction. Scott Tenorman spent the whole episode humiliating Cartman. He tricked him. He stole his money. He publicly embarrassed him. And then Cartman destroys him so completely, so disproportionately, that the shock becomes a kind of awe. The episode is rated 9.7 on IMDb. It's consistently ranked as one of the greatest South Park episodes ever made. And I think it deserves that ranking as a piece of television. The construction is flawless. The misdirection is brilliantly executed. The final reveal is a genuine jaw-drop moment. But think about what we're celebrating. We're celebrating the most sociopathic act in the history of animated television, committed by a child. We're celebrating a murder played for laughs. And we're doing it because South Park has spent 5 seasons training us to find Cartman's evil funny rather than disturbing. We've been conditioned. The show has calibrated our moral responses so precisely that when an 8-year-old commits double murder and cannibalism by proxy, our response isn't horror, it's applause. Is that a moral failure of the show? Or is it a moral commentary by the show? Is South Park saying, look how easily your moral compass can be manipulated? Or is it just manipulating your moral compass? Honestly, I think it's both. I think Parker and Stone wanted to create the most shocking twist in the show's history, and they did. I also think the episode functions as a kind of test, a litmus test for how desensitized the audience has become. If you watch Scott Tenorman Must Die, and your first reaction is, that was awesome, the show has just demonstrated something uncomfortable about your own moral flexibility. And this connects to a larger point about South Park's relationship with morality. The show doesn't just comment on moral questions. It actively plays with the audience's moral instincts. It trains you to laugh at things you shouldn't laugh at, then occasionally reminds you that you're laughing at things you shouldn't laugh at. And the discomfort of that recognition is part of the experience. Think about Cartman generally. This is a character who has done the following things over the course of the series: engineered the murder of 2 people and fed them to their son, dressed as Hitler, started a race war, manipulated a girl into a relationship for purely selfish reasons, attempted to exterminate the Jewish people, enslaved Butters multiple times, and yet He's the most popular character on the show. He's the one people love. He's the one they quote. He's the one they dress as for Halloween. What does it mean that the most beloved character on one of America's most influential shows is a sociopathic white supremacist? What does it mean that the show knows he's a sociopathic white supremacist and portrays him as such, but also makes him the funniest, most magnetic, most endlessly entertaining character on screen? I don't think South Park is endorsing Cartman's worldview. I think the show is very clear that Cartman is a monster, but I also think the show loves Cartman, and I think that love, that gleeful delight in his worst impulses, creates a space where the audience's own worst impulses feel validated, not endorsed, not recommended, but validated, made safe, made funny. This is the thing about South Park that the show's critics miss, and its defenders refuse to acknowledge. The show isn't propaganda. It's not trying to make people racist, or transphobic, or apathetic, but it creates an environment, a tonal environment, a comedic environment, where those things become lighter, where they lose their weight, where the appropriate moral response is replaced by laughter. And whether that's liberation or corruption depends entirely on your faith in the audience's ability to distinguish between laughing at and agreeing with. Parker and Stone have enormous faith in their audience. They believe people can hold the joke and the moral at the same time. They believe you can laugh at Cartman's anti-Semitism while also understanding that anti-Semitism is wrong. They believe you can find the Tuong Lu Kim accent funny while also recognizing it as a stereotype. They believe comedy is robust enough to contain contradictions without collapsing into either nihilism or propaganda. And maybe they're right. Maybe most of their audience does navigate those contradictions successfully. But most isn't all. And for the people who don't, the teenager who uses South Park references to bully a trans classmate, the young man who cites douche and turd as justification for not voting, the viewer who watched Man Bear Pig and decided that caring about the environment was for suckers, for those people, South Park's faith in its audience was misplaced, and the consequences were real. I want to go deeper into something here, because I think there's a whole dimension of this conversation that we haven't touched yet, and it has to do with how South Park handles the concept of caring itself. There's an episode called Butt Out, Season 7, Episode 13, December 3rd, 2003, where an anti-smoking group visits South Park Elementary and performs a cringeworthy presentation for the kids. The presentation is so lame, so preachy, so transparently manipulative that the boys are actually inspired to start smoking just to rebel against the messengers. The episode goes on to satirize anti-smoking activists, portraying Rob Reiner as a manipulative, hypocritical zealot who will stop at nothing to push his anti-tobacco agenda, including putting the boys in danger. And here's the thing that makes this episode so perfectly South Park. The show isn't pro-smoking. It never says cigarettes are good for you, but it's deeply, viscerally hostile to the people who are against smoking. The messengers become the enemy. The people trying to prevent kids from getting cancer are portrayed as bigger villains than the tobacco companies. Because they committed the unforgivable sin in South Park's worldview, they cared too much. They were preachy. They were earnest. They were trying to change people's behavior. This is the show's deepest, recurring pattern. It doesn't attack positions so much as it attacks conviction. It doesn't critique arguments so much as it critiques the intensity with which arguments are made. The louder someone cares about something, the more ridiculous they become in South Park's framing. And the perverse result is that people who are fighting genuine evils, tobacco companies targeting children, climate change threatening the planet, discrimination harming vulnerable communities, get mocked not for being wrong, but for caring too visibly. I think about Goobacks, Season 8, Episode 7, April 28th, 2004. Immigrants from the future travel back in time because the future is so economically devastated that even minimum wage jobs in the present are a step up. The townspeople's response splits into two camps. Some want to build a wall and keep the time immigrants out, chanting the catchphrase that became instantly iconic. And others want to address the root cause by making the future better. Both sides are mocked. The wall builders are idiots. The future improvers are sanctimonious. And the episode ends with everyone deciding that maybe the best approach is somewhere in the middle. Specifically, everyone piling into a big group situation that I'm not going to describe in detail because you either know it or you can look it up. The episode is hilarious. The time immigrant concept is genuinely clever. The satire of immigration panic is sharp, but the both sides resolution reveals the show's limitations once again. One side, the people who want to build a wall and exclude immigrants, is driven by xenophobia and short-term self-interest. The other side, the people who want to address systemic issues that create immigration pressure, is driven by empathy and long-term thinking. These are not morally equivalent positions, but South Park treats them as such, because in the show's worldview, the real sin isn't being wrong. It's being passionate about being right. This pattern reaches its most crystallized form in season 19, which aired in 2015. That whole season is a sustained engagement with what would eventually be labeled woke culture. PC Principal arrives at South Park Elementary, a hulking fraternity bro who physically enforces political correctness. The season introduces the PC concept as a kind of fascism of niceness, where saying the wrong thing gets you beaten up by progressive vigilantes in Oakley sunglasses. And look, there is genuine insight here. There is something worth satirizing about the way political correctness can become performative, about the way progressive language can be weaponized for social status rather than genuine empathy, about the gap between saying the right things and actually doing the right things. These are real phenomena, and South Park is well positioned to critique them. But the season also does something that I think is genuinely harmful. It positions any concern for inclusive language, for sensitivity, for the feelings of marginalized people, as inherently suspect. PC Principal isn't just mocking performative wokeness. He's mocking the underlying impulse to be considerate of other people's experiences. And by making that impulse look ridiculous, aggressive, and authoritarian. The season gives ammunition to everyone who wanted an excuse to dismiss legitimate concerns about representation, inclusivity, and systemic prejudice. I saw this happen in real time. I saw people I knew, people who were considering modifying their language or examining their assumptions, watch season 19 and decide that the whole enterprise was a joke, that political correctness was inherently laughable, that anyone who asked them to think about their words was a PC bro in Oakley sunglasses. South Park gave them a caricature to point at and say, see, that's what you sound like. And the caricature was effective enough that the underlying message, hey, maybe consider how your words affect other people, got thrown out with the bathwater. This is the show's superpower and its greatest weapon. South Park doesn't need to argue against a position. It just needs to make the people who hold that position look ridiculous. And because the show is so funny, so good at constructing comic characters, so precise in its ability to capture the worst version of any movement, the ridicule sticks. It sticks even when the underlying cause is legitimate. It sticks even when the people being mocked have important things to say. It sticks because laughter is more powerful than argument, and South Park knows that better than any show that's ever been on the air. I need to talk about the Cartman-Heidi relationship. Season 20 and 21. This is South Park's most sustained attempt at telling a story about emotional abuse, and I think it's genuinely one of the show's most morally interesting arcs, partly because it works, and partly because it doesn't. Heidi Turner starts dating Cartman in season 20 after quitting social media. She's smart, she's thoughtful, she's kind. And Cartman systematically manipulates her, gaslights her, isolates her from her friends, and gradually reshapes her personality to mirror his own worst qualities. By the end of season 21, Heidi has become a version of Cartman, mean, selfish, and cruel, before finally breaking free. There's something powerful about this arc. The show uses its most despicable character to illustrate, over the course of 2 seasons, how emotional abuse operates, how the abuser cycles between charm and cruelty, how the victim gradually loses their sense of self, how escape requires not just leaving the relationship, but reclaiming the identity that was eroded within it. This is genuine moral ambition. This is South Park using its tools. Long-form storytelling, character development, the audience's intimate knowledge of who Cartman is, to say something real and important about how relationships can become prisons. But I think the arc also reveals something uncomfortable about the show's moral capabilities. Because at the end of the day, the Cartman-Heidi storyline exists within the same show that can't take trans people seriously. The same show that mocks women for caring too much. The same show whose fundamental worldview, everyone's an idiot, nothing matters, caring is for suckers, is actively hostile to the kind of emotional seriousness that a story about abuse requires. And you can feel the tension in the episodes. The show wants to take Heidi's pain seriously, but it also can't quite resist the urge to make it funny. It wants to portray Cartman as a genuine abuser, but it also can't stop finding his manipulation entertaining. It wants the audience to feel something for Heidi, but it spent 20 seasons training the audience to feel nothing for anyone. I actually think this tension is more interesting than the arc itself. It's South Park bumping up against the limits of its own worldview, discovering that there are some moral subjects that can't be adequately addressed within a framework of ironic detachment. That some things require earnestness, require the vulnerability of genuine emotional engagement, require the narrator to drop the joke and say, "This matters, and I need you to take it seriously." South Park can almost do this. You're Getting Old and Asperger's in season 15, Stan's depression arc, where everything starts to sound like crap, come close. Kenny Dies in season 5 comes close. The end of Dead Kids comes close. But the show always pulls back, always retreats to irony, always puts the joke back in place, like a shield against the vulnerability that genuine moral engagement demands. And I think that pullback, that reflexive retreat from sincerity, is South Park's most morally significant failure. Not any individual episode, not any specific position, but the inability to fully commit to the emotional truth of its own insights. The fear that if you stop being funny for even a moment, you'll be exposed as someone who actually cares about something. And in South Park's world, caring is the one thing you can never do, except when they do. Except in those rare, extraordinary moments when the joke drops away and something real comes through. When Stan tells Tolkien, "I don't get it." When Sharon can't stop crying about dead children. When the smug denier gets eaten by the consequences he denied. When the boys grovel before Al Gore and admit they were wrong. Those moments are South Park at its moral best. And they only work because they're rare. Because they're surrounded by 20 seasons of irony and deflection, and both sides, and nothing matters. The sincerity hits harder because the insincerity is the norm. The care matters more because not caring is the default. Is that a design? Is that a conscious artistic strategy? Surround the moments of genuine moral insight with so much noise that when the signal finally breaks through, it's unmistakable? Or is it just what happens when two guys who are afraid of being earnest accidentally stumble into earnestness and can't help themselves? I don't know. I honestly don't know. But I think the question itself is worth asking. And I think the fact that South Park makes you ask questions like this, about comedy, about morality, about the relationship between laughing at the world and trying to make it better, is, in itself, a kind of moral achievement. A weird, uncomfortable, frequently offensive moral achievement, but a real one. Let me tell you about a specific moment that I keep coming back to. It's from the season 22 two-parter about Man Bear Pig. The scene in the restaurant. The climate change denier, sitting there with his wine, calmly explaining why Man Bear Pig can't be real, while the creature literally tears the restaurant apart behind him. Okay, Man Bear Pig is real, but what are we gonna do about it at this point, Susan? And then he starts blaming China. And then Man Bear Pig eats him. That scene is aimed at people like 2006 Parker and Stone, the people who were confidently, smugly wrong about something that mattered. And the fact that Parker and Stone created that scene, that they wrote themselves as the smug denier being devoured by the consequences of their own willful ignorance, is extraordinary. It's an act of self-critique that I genuinely can't think of another parallel for in television history. But there's another scene in that same two-parter that's even more devastating. The scene where Stan confronts his grandfather about why the town made a deal with Man Bear Pig in the first place. And Stan's grandfather admits that his generation signed a pact. They could keep all their comforts, their cars, their conveniences, their way of life, in exchange for Man Bear Pig terrorizing future generations. "We thought we'd be dead by now," the old woman says. "We didn't think we'd have to live to see the consequences." Stan is furious. He says his grandfather sold out his future. And his grandfather basically says, "Yeah, we did. Sorry about that." And then Stan, representing the next generation, has to negotiate with Man Bear Pig himself. And the deal he's offered is the same deal his grandparents took. He can keep his comforts. Specifically, the show named soy sauce and Red Dead Redemption 2. But in exchange, Man Bear Pig will keep killing children in the third world for another 5 years, after which the consequences will be 1,000 times worse. And Stan takes the deal. That's the most morally devastating joke South Park has ever told. Not because it's wrong, because it's right. Because we all take that deal every day. We all choose our comforts over other people's suffering. We all kick the can down the road. And South Park, which spent 12 years being part of the problem, is now unflinching about naming the problem, including its own role in it. I need to take a breath here, because I realize I've been going for a while, and this is supposed to be the kind of video you fall asleep to. And I'm not sure I'm creating very restful energy right now. So let me shift gears slightly, and talk about something that I think ties everything together. Actually, before I get to that, I want to spend some time on something specific that I think illustrates the moral complexity of this show better than almost anything else we've discussed tonight. And that's the 200 and 201 two-parter. Season 14, episodes 5 and 6, April 14th and 21st, 2010. These are the episodes that were effectively banned, pulled from streaming, removed from availability. And the story of why they were pulled is, I think, the most morally interesting thing South Park has ever been involved in. The premise: every celebrity South Park has ever mocked bands together to sue the town. Tom Cruise leads the lawsuit. The only thing that can appease the celebrities is the power of Muhammad, specifically, the power to not be ridiculed, which Muhammad apparently possesses by virtue of being the one figure nobody is allowed to depict. The boys have to find Muhammad, who has been hidden by the Super Best Friends, a team of religious figures including Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, and Joseph Smith, who first appeared in Super Best Friends back in Season 5. The episodes are dense with callbacks to the show's entire history. They revisit the question of Cartman's parentage. They bring back Scott Tenorman. They reference dozens of previous storylines. They're essentially South Park's love letter to itself. But the Muhammad element is what caused the real-world firestorm. A group called Revolution Muslim posted a warning on their website that included the addresses of South Park's production office and suggested that Parker and Stone could end up like Theo Van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker who was murdered in 2004 for making a film critical of Islam. Comedy Central responded by heavily censoring 201, bleeping out Muhammad's name throughout the episode, and censoring the entire final speech, which was reportedly about the nature of intimidation and free expression. Parker and Stone had no say in the censorship. Both episodes were subsequently removed from South Park Studios, the show's official streaming platform. Super Best Friends, which had aired without controversy in 2001 and actually depicted Muhammad as a character, was also pulled. As of today, these episodes remain unavailable on any official platform. And here's where it gets morally complicated. On one hand, South Park was doing something genuinely important. It was testing whether a comedy show in a democratic society could depict a religious figure without being silenced by threats of violence. That's a fundamental free speech question, and the answer, that Comedy Central chose censorship over supporting its creators, is deeply troubling. The fact that threats of violence were effective in suppressing artistic expression is a moral failure, but it's not South Park's moral failure. It's society's. On the other hand, and I need to be careful here, because I want to be precise, the question of whether you should depict Muhammad isn't the same as the question of whether you can. Parker and Stone had the right to do it, but rights and responsibilities are different things. And the people who bore the real-world risk weren't Parker and Stone. It was ordinary Muslims who faced increased suspicion and hostility every time a high-profile controversy erupted around depictions of their prophet. The creators went home to their security systems. Muslim families went home to neighbors who'd been watching the news. This is the hardest moral territory we've covered tonight, and I want to handle it honestly. I think Parker and Stone were right to challenge censorship through intimidation. I think Comedy Central was wrong to capitulate. I think the threats made against the show were criminal and contemptible. And I also think that the broader cultural discourse around "should we depict Muhammad?" often lacks compassion for the millions of peaceful Muslims who have nothing to do with violent extremists, and who experience real consequences when these controversies flare up. South Park, characteristically, didn't engage with that compassion. The show's position was simple: nobody gets special treatment. If we can mock Jesus and Buddha and Joseph Smith, we can mock Muhammad. And in principle, I agree. But in practice, the stakes are different for different communities. The consequences of mocking Jesus in a majority Christian country are an angry email from the Catholic League. The consequences of depicting Muhammad in a world where cartoonists have been murdered for doing so are potentially lethal. Context matters, even when principles don't change. I keep coming back to this idea that South Park's greatest strength, treating everything the same, is also its greatest weakness. Because everything isn't the same. Power isn't distributed equally. Risk isn't distributed equally. And a philosophy that refuses to account for those differences, while admirable in its consistency, can cause real harm in its application. Let me bring it back to something that connects all of this. There's a term in philosophy, moral luck. It refers to the way our moral judgments of people are influenced by factors beyond their control. Two people can make the same reckless decision, say, driving after a couple of drinks, and one gets home safe and the other hits a pedestrian. Same choice, same recklessness. But we judge the second person far more harshly, even though the difference between them is just luck. I think about moral luck a lot when I think about South Park. Parker and Stone made hundreds of episodes, took hundreds of moral positions, offended hundreds of groups. Some of those positions turned out to be right. Some turned out to be wrong. Some caused measurable harm. Some prevented it. And a lot of the difference between South Park brilliantly satirized X and South Park cruelly mocked Y comes down to factors the creators couldn't have predicted. Which issues would become more urgent over time? Which groups would gain visibility? Which cultural shifts would reframe old jokes as newly harmful? Man Bear Pig was made in 2006 when climate denial was common and culturally tolerated. If the climate science hadn't become so overwhelmingly clear, if the consequences hadn't become so visible, the episode might have aged into harmless irrelevance rather than active harm. The moral evaluation of the episode changed because the world changed, not because Parker and Stone's intentions were worse than we thought. Similarly, Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina was made in 2005 when trans visibility was minimal. If trans rights hadn't become a major cultural conversation, if trans people hadn't gained visibility and voice, the episode might have remained a dated curiosity rather than a live wound. Again, same episode, different moral weight, because of factors the creators didn't control. Does this let Parker and Stone off the hook? No. Moral luck doesn't eliminate responsibility. They still chose to make those episodes. They still chose those targets. They still chose the arguments they embedded in the comedy. But moral luck does complicate the simple story of South Park was wrong about X, because the wrongness only became fully visible in retrospect, after the world moved in ways the creators couldn't predict. And here's where I arrive at something I think is genuinely important, and I want to say it clearly before we get to the end of this. The reason South Park is worth talking about, worth this many words, this many hours, this many rewatches, isn't because it's good or because it's bad. It's because it's the most honest record we have of how a pair of smart, funny, morally imperfect people responded to 29 years of American life. Every episode is a time capsule, not just of what was happening in the culture, but of what two specific human beings thought about what was happening. And those thoughts, captured in 6 days, animated in construction paper, broadcast to millions, are sometimes brilliant, sometimes stupid, sometimes compassionate, sometimes cruel, and always, always honest in the moment they were made. That honesty is the thing I keep coming back to. South Park doesn't hedge. It doesn't focus group. It doesn't run its positions through a PR filter. It says what it thinks in the moment it thinks it and lets the audience sort out the consequences. And sometimes the consequences are wonderful. A corrupt institution exposed, a cultural blind spot illuminated, a moral insight so sharp it changes how people think. And sometimes the consequences are terrible. A vulnerable group mocked, a legitimate concern dismissed, a generation of viewers taught that caring is for suckers. Both are South Park. Both are real. And the show, to its extraordinary credit, doesn't try to deny either one. The 6-day production cycle. If you're a regular here at Papertown, you know about this. South Park is made in 6 days. 6 days from concept to broadcast. The writer's room meets on Thursday. The script is written by Friday or Saturday. Animation begins on Monday. And the episode airs Wednesday night. The 6 Days to Air documentary, directed by Arthur Bradford and premiering on October 9th, 2011, captured this process and was later nominated for an Emmy. Most shows take months to produce an episode. South Park takes less than a week, and this production schedule is directly relevant to the show's moral character because it means South Park episodes are reactions, not reflections. They're gut responses to the cultural moment, not considered philosophical positions developed over time. When Parker and Stone made Man, Bear, Pig, they weren't sitting down with climate data and carefully evaluating the scientific evidence. They were reacting to Al Gore's public persona, the earnestness, the self-importance, the crusading energy, and their gut said, "This guy is annoying." And within 6 days, that gut reaction became a cultural artifact that influenced millions of people's views on climate change for over a decade. When they made Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina, they weren't consulting with transgender people or reading gender theory. They were reacting to the cultural discomfort around transition in 2005. And their gut said, "This is weird and maybe ridiculous." And within 6 days, that gut reaction became an episode that told trans viewers they were delusional. The 6-day cycle is what makes South Park feel immediate and honest. It's also what makes it reckless. There's no time for second thoughts. No time to ask, are we being fair? No time to consider who might be hurt. The gut speaks, and the gut goes on the air. This is important because it means South Park's moral failures aren't calculated. They're not the product of careful deliberation that arrived at the wrong conclusion. They're the product of no deliberation at all. They're gut reactions that were never subjected to scrutiny before being broadcast to millions. And that, I think, is both the show's greatest virtue and its greatest sin. The immediacy gives it authenticity, but authenticity without reflection is just thoughtlessness with good branding. I want to wrap these two threads together now, because we've been running them in parallel long enough, and I think they're ready to converge. Thread 1. South Park as moral failure. Climate change denial. Transphobia. False equivalence. Racial stereotyping. A philosophy of both sidesism that flattens genuine moral distinctions. A cult of not caring that gives permission for apathy. A beloved sociopathic character who makes hatred funny. Real harm done to real people over decades. Thread 2. South Park as moral reckoning. The Man, Bear, Pig correction. With apologies to Jesse Jackson, Trapped in the Closet, Dead Kids. A show with the extraordinary capacity to confront its own mistakes. A willingness to be wrong in public that, paradoxically, makes its corrections meaningful. An honesty about human moral messiness that more responsible shows are too careful to attempt. Here's where they converge. Here's what I think is actually going on. South Park is morally wrong in the way that a person is morally wrong. Not a villain, not an institution. A person. Someone who has strong opinions, acts on them quickly, gets some of them catastrophically wrong, refuses to apologize for a long time, and then occasionally has a moment of genuine moral growth that only means something because the failure came first. Parker and Stone are not moral philosophers. They're not teachers. They're not activists. They're two guys from Colorado who react to the world in real time, through comedy, with the volume turned all the way up. And their reactions, like all gut reactions, are sometimes brilliant and sometimes terrible. The question isn't whether South Park is a morally good show or a morally bad show. The question is whether the bargain is worth it, whether the insights are worth the blind spots, whether the corrections are worth the damage, whether a show that takes moral risks and genuinely fails with genuine consequences is more valuable than a show that plays it safe. And I keep coming back to this. If South Park had never made Man, Bear, Pig, the show would never have needed to make Time to Get Cereal. But if South Park had never made Time to Get Cereal, the cultural conversation about climate change would have lost one of its most striking moments of public self-correction. The failure made the redemption possible. The redemption wouldn't have mattered without the failure. I don't know if that calculus works out in South Park's favor. I genuinely don't. There are trans kids who grew up hearing that they were the punchline of a dolphin joke, and no amount of self-correction about climate change makes that okay. There are young people who didn't vote because a cartoon told them it was pointless, and no Scientology expose compensates for that civic disengagement. But I also know that moral perfection isn't possible. Not for a person, not for a show, not for anyone who's actually engaging with the complexity of the world, rather than hiding from it. And South Park, for all its failures, has never hidden from anything. The show has been on the air since August 13th, 1997. That's nearly 29 years. Over 320 episodes, 27 seasons. Two guys who met at the University of Colorado in 1992 and have been making this thing together ever since. And across all those years, all those episodes, all those controversies, what emerges is something that looks less like a consistent moral position and more like a moral journey, with wrong turns, with dead ends, with the occasional breathtaking vista. And isn't that what morality actually looks like? Not a destination, but a process. Not a set of correct positions, but a continuous, messy, sometimes painful engagement with questions that don't have clean answers? I think South Park would say yes. I think that's what the show has been saying all along, even when it was saying it badly. But before I wrap this up, I want to go somewhere I haven't gone yet tonight, because there's one more dimension to South Park being morally wrong that I think deserves attention, and it's the one people are least comfortable talking about: the show's relationship with women. I know, I can already hear some of you groaning, but hear me out, because this isn't going to be the argument you're expecting. South Park has always been, at its core, a show about boys, about male friendships, male anxieties, male coming of age. The four main characters are boys. The show's emotional core, the Stan-Kyle friendship, the Cartman-Butters dynamic, Kenny's silent resilience, is exclusively male. And that's fine. Not every show needs to center women. Not every story needs to be about gender balance. But here's what I've noticed after rewatching so many episodes for this channel. The women in South Park are almost exclusively defined by their relationships to the men. Sharon is Stan's mom. Leanne is Cartman's mom. Sheila is Kyle's mom. Wendy is Stan's girlfriend. And while each of them has had individual spotlight episodes, Sheila's crusade in the movie, Sharon's desperation in Dead Kids, Wendy's competition with Cartman in Breast Cancer Show Ever, they exist in the show's universe primarily as reactions to what the male characters are doing. Wendy Testaberger is the most interesting case. She's smart, she's politically engaged, she's morally serious in a way that the boys usually aren't. She's the feminist voice of the show. And yet, episode after episode, her earnestness is played as annoying. Her activism is played as overreaction. Her moral seriousness is positioned as the thing that needs to be deflated. In Dances with Smurfs, Season 13, Episode 13, November 11th, 2009, Cartman becomes the school news anchor and uses his platform to spread conspiracies about Wendy, essentially a Glenn Beck parody. The episode is sharp about media manipulation, but it also reinforces the show's tendency to make Wendy the person who cares too much about things that the audience, positioned by the show's worldview, is supposed to find trivial. And then there's The Hobbit, Season 17, Episode 10, December 11th, 2013. Wendy tries to challenge the unrealistic beauty standards promoted by photoshopped images of Kim Kardashian. Her argument is sound. These images create false expectations that damage girls' self-esteem. But the episode ends with Wendy, after fighting the good fight all episode, photoshopping her own image. She gives up. The culture wins. Even the character who's supposed to represent genuine feminist concern is ultimately defeated by the system she's critiquing. Now, is this episode morally wrong? In a weird way, I think it might actually be morally honest. The point isn't that Wendy was wrong to fight. The point is that the pressure to conform is so enormous that even the most principled person can be broken by it. That's a genuinely devastating observation about how beauty standards operate. But it's also an observation that leaves Wendy, the show's only consistent female voice of moral authority, diminished, broken, absorbed into the machine she was trying to dismantle. I've been rewatching these episodes and thinking about what it means that the show's answer to genuine female activism is almost always deflation. When Sheila campaigns against profanity in the movie, she starts a war. When Sharon worries about school shootings, she's on her period. When Wendy fights beauty standards, she capitulates. The pattern is consistent. Women who care about things are, in South Park's framing, the problem. Not because they're wrong. The show often acknowledges they have a point, but because their caring disrupts the comfortable apathy that the show's worldview depends on. This connects back to everything we've been talking about tonight. South Park's deepest moral commitment is to the idea that caring too much is the cardinal sin. And because women in the show's universe tend to be the ones who care about language, about safety, about appearance, about justice, they tend to be the ones who are pathologized. Their concern is reframed as hysteria. Their activism is reframed as nagging. Their moral seriousness is reframed as the thing that stops everyone else from having fun. I'm not saying Parker and Stone are misogynists. I think the issue is more structural than personal. South Park is a show built around a very specific form of masculine detachment. The idea that the coolest, smartest, most liberated thing you can do is not care. And in that framework, anyone who cares about anything becomes the adversary. It just so happens that in the show's world, the characters who care most visibly and most persistently are usually women. Okay, one more thing. One more thread I want to pull before I bring this all together. And this is something I've been sitting with for days, and I still don't know if I've fully figured it out, but I want to share it with you because I think it matters. South Park is almost 30 years old. Think about that. A show that started as two guys cutting out construction paper in their apartment has been on the air for nearly 3 decades. It's outlasted marriages, presidencies, entire technological eras. It started before Google existed, before social media, before smartphones, before streaming, before the entire cultural infrastructure that defines our current moment. And during those 30 years, the world changed in ways that fundamentally altered the context in which the show's humor operates. When Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina aired in 2005, most Americans had never knowingly met a transgender person. Trans visibility was virtually zero in mainstream media. The cultural conversation about gender identity simply didn't exist in the way it does now. That doesn't make the episode's cruelty okay. It was cruel in 2005 too, to the trans people who did exist and did watch it. But the episode existed in a different informational environment. Parker and Stone were making jokes about something they knew virtually nothing about, to an audience that knew even less. By the time Bored Girls aired in 2019, the landscape had shifted dramatically. Trans visibility had increased enormously. The medical and psychological consensus on gender dysphoria had evolved. The real-world stakes of anti-trans rhetoric, legislative attacks on trans rights, rising violence against trans people, the mental health crisis among trans youth were well documented and widely discussed. Making the same kind of joke in 2019 that you made in 2005 isn't just the same joke repeated. It's a different moral act because the context has changed. The joke hits differently when the audience includes more trans viewers, when trans people are more visible targets of real violence, when the "it's just a joke" defense has been visibly weaponized by people who use comedy as cover for genuine bigotry. And I think this is maybe the most important thing I want to say tonight. South Park's moral failures aren't static. They exist in time. They interact with a changing world. An episode that was merely crude in 2005 can become actively harmful in 2019. Not because the episode changed, but because the world did. And a show that refuses to update its understanding of that world, that keeps making the same jokes about the same groups as if the context hasn't shifted, isn't being consistent. It's being stubborn. And stubbornness in the face of new information isn't a virtue. It's the thing South Park made fun of Al Gore for, before admitting he was right all along. This is the paradox of long-running satire. The longer a show goes, the more its old episodes become artifacts of a different moral moment. And the question becomes, does the show grow with its audience? Or does it cling to positions that the audience has outgrown? South Park has done both. On climate change, it grew. It reconsidered. It self-corrected in a way that was genuinely brave. On transgender issues, it hasn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that asymmetry, the willingness to admit you were wrong about one thing while doubling down on another, is, I think, the most honestly human thing about the show. We're all like this. We all have topics where we can see clearly, and topics where we can't. We all have blind spots that persist even as other blind spots dissolve. The difference, again, is that most of us work through this privately. Parker and Stone do it in front of millions. And you know, I think the Tegrity Farms era, roughly seasons 22 through 25, is itself a kind of meta-commentary on exactly the exhaustion we've been talking about. Randy moves the family to a marijuana farm. He becomes obsessed with weed. The seasons that follow are divided among fans. Some love the Randy-centric, farm-based storylines. Others feel the show lost its edge by moving away from the boys and their school-based adventures. But there's something I find fascinating about the Tegrity era in the context of this video. Randy's Tegrity Farms isn't just a marijuana farm. It's a retreat. It's a withdrawal from engagement. Randy literally moves his family out of town, away from the chaos of South Park, to grow weed and insulate himself from the world's problems. And the running joke is that his integrity, is entirely performative. He doesn't actually have integrity. He just has a brand that sounds like he does. That feels like a confession. Like Parker and Stone looking at their own brand. We're the guys who tell it like it is, who see through everyone's bullshit, who have the integrity to mock everyone equally, and admitting that the brand is just a brand. That tegrity is something you claim, not something you earn. That retreating to a farm and growing weed isn't wisdom. It's just a different kind of cowardice. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe a marijuana farm is just a marijuana farm, and the tegrity pun is just a pun. But after all the episodes we've discussed tonight, after the climate denial, the trans mockery, the both sides centrism, the PC principle arc, the women as nags pattern, I think there's something genuinely self-aware about the tegrity branding. Parker and Stone know their reputation. They know people see them as the guys with integrity, the fearless truth tellers, the equal opportunity offenders, the only honest voices in a sea of cowardice and political correctness. And I think Tegrity Farms is their way of saying that reputation is partly earned and partly bullshit, just like Randy's farm. There's one more thing I want to address before I start wrapping up, and it's the question of legacy. What will South Park's moral legacy be? When people look back at this show in 50 years, what will they see? I think they'll see a show that was braver than almost anything else on television. A show that took on Scientology when nobody else would, that depicted the inner workings of a manipulative organization to a mass audience, that refused to be silenced by threats and lawsuits and investigations. They'll see a show that forced a conversation about climate change denial by publicly admitting it had been part of the problem. They'll see a show that used crude humor to illuminate genuine moral truths about race, about empathy, about the limits of human understanding. And I think they'll also see a show that was cruel to people who didn't deserve it. A show that mocked trans people during a period when trans youth were in crisis. A show that told young people voting was pointless during elections that shaped the course of history. A show that treated every form of caring as equally ridiculous, flattening real moral distinctions into a philosophy of detached amusement. Both of those legacies are real. Both of those legacies are permanent. And the show itself, characteristically, maddeningly, beautifully, doesn't seem to care which one wins out. It just keeps making episodes, 6 days at a time. Gut reactions to a changing world. Sometimes brilliant, sometimes terrible. Always honest about what two guys from Colorado thought at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, under deadline pressure, powered by caffeine and anxiety, and a genuine love for a show they've been making since they were barely out of college. I find that kind of extraordinary. Not the moral rightness or the moral wrongness, the persistence, the refusal to stop engaging, the willingness to keep putting yourself out there, keep being publicly wrong, keep being publicly right, keep making something that matters, even when you're not sure what it means. And maybe that's the final thought I want to leave you with tonight. Not a judgment of South Park, not a verdict, not a neat conclusion that ties everything up with a bow, but an observation about what it takes to make something for nearly 30 years and still be willing to be wrong. Most creators, by year 5 or 10, have figured out their audience. They know what works. They know what's safe. They know how to produce content that satisfies expectations without challenging them. And that's fine. That's how most creative enterprises operate. Give the audience what they want. Don't surprise them. Don't make them uncomfortable. Don't risk the relationship. Parker and Stone never did that. Every season, they risk alienating their audience. Every season, they say something that a significant portion of their viewers will disagree with. Every season, they take a position that might age terribly. And some of those positions have aged terribly, as we've spent the last several hours documenting. But they keep doing it. They keep swinging. They keep treating their audience as capable of handling disagreement, discomfort, and moral ambiguity. Is that arrogant? Maybe. Is it irresponsible? Sometimes. Is it the reason the show is still relevant after 27 seasons when most animated shows flame out after 5? Absolutely. South Park survives because it refuses to play it safe. And playing it safe, in the world of comedy, is its own kind of moral failure. The failure to engage, the failure to provoke, the failure to force your audience to think about things they'd rather not think about. I've been making Paper Town videos for a while now, and every time I sit down to write about South Park, I learn something new. Not just about the show, but about myself, about what I laugh at, and why. About which moral positions I've inherited from a cartoon, and which I've actually thought through on my own. About the difference between being entertained by an idea and believing it. This video taught me more than any previous one. It taught me that the show I grew up with shaped my moral instincts in ways I'm only now fully recognizing. Some of those instincts are good: the skepticism, the willingness to question authority, the refusal to accept received wisdom without examination. Some of them are bad: the reflexive cynicism, the distrust of passion, the assumption that everyone who cares about something is performing their care rather than feeling it. South Park gave me both, and untangling them, figuring out which moral instincts to keep and which to discard, is, I think, the actual work of growing up. Not just for me, for everyone who watched this show during their formative years and absorbed its worldview without fully examining it. So maybe that's the real answer to the question I opened with. Is South Park the most morally confused show in television history, or the most morally honest one? Maybe it's both. Maybe the confusion is the honesty. Maybe a show that confidently delivered moral clarity on every issue would be the dishonest one, because moral clarity, in a world this complicated, is itself a form of deception. I don't know. And tonight, for the first time, I'm comfortable not knowing. I've been thinking about what it would look like if South Park did its man-bear-pig moment on trans issues. If there were an episode sometime in the future, maybe season 28, maybe later, where the show acknowledged that its portrayal of trans people had been reductive, harmful, and rooted in ignorance, where Garrison was allowed to be a real character rather than a punchline, where the dolphinoplasty comparison was explicitly repudiated. Would that undo the damage? No. Just like Time to Get Cereal didn't undo 12 years of climate denial. But it would matter. It would matter in the same way all moral growth matters. Not because it fixes the past, but because it demonstrates that the past can be confronted, learned from, and transcended. And that demonstration, coming from a show as influential as South Park, would ripple outward into the culture in ways that are impossible to predict, but almost certainly positive. I don't know if it'll happen. I'm not holding my breath, but I hope it does. Because the version of South Park that admitted it was wrong about climate change is a better show than the version that denied it. And the version of South Park that might someday admit it was wrong about trans people would be better still. Not because perfection is the goal, but because growth is. You know what's funny? And I mean actually funny, not South Park funny. When I started this script, I had a very clear thesis. South Park has been morally wrong about many things, and we should talk about that honestly. Simple, clean, prosecutorial. But the more I wrote, the more the thesis kept slipping away from me. Because every time I identified a moral failure, I found a moral success that came from the same place. Every time I wanted to condemn the show, I found a reason to admire it. Every time I thought I'd arrived at a clear verdict, the show's own complexity undermined my certainty. And I think that's the real lesson here. Not about South Park, about morality itself, about how the honest engagement with difficult questions, even when you get the answers wrong, even when you hurt people along the way, is more morally valuable than the careful avoidance of difficult questions. About how a show that swings wildly between brilliance and catastrophe is doing something braver than a show that plays it safe. About how the willingness to be publicly wrong is, in a strange way, the foundation of everything that's right about this deeply flawed, endlessly fascinating, morally chaotic, occasionally magnificent show. I've watched South Park for most of my life, and tonight, for the first time, I think I understand why. It's not because the show gives me answers. It's because the show gives me questions. Hard questions. Uncomfortable questions. Questions I'd rather not sit with. And then it forces me to sit with them anyway, disguised as fart jokes and construction paper and an 8-year-old sociopath eating chili. That's what South Park does. That's what it's always done, even when it does it badly, even when it does it wrong, especially when it does it wrong. Here's what this topic genuinely taught me, and I wasn't expecting this when I started putting this script together. I went in thinking I was going to make a video about a show being wrong, about specific episodes, specific takes, specific moral failures, cataloged and critiqued. And I did do that. All the failures I've described tonight are real. The harm was real. I'm not walking any of that back. But somewhere in the middle of writing this, somewhere around my third rewatch of the Man-Bear-Pig correction, somewhere around the moment Stan's grandfather admits to selling out the future, I realized that the thing I actually admire most about South Park isn't when it's right. It's when it's wrong and knows it. Because knowing you're wrong is harder than being right. Admitting you're wrong on national television, in the text of your own work, to the same audience you misled, that's something most creators, most public figures, most people will never do. We live in a culture where changing your mind is treated as weakness, where admitting error is career poison, where the pressure is always to double down rather than correct course. And South Park, this crude, offensive, morally chaotic show about 4 kids made of construction paper, has done the thing that almost nobody does. Not consistently. Not about everything, but about some things. And the things it corrected were big. I started making this video thinking it would be a critique. I think it ended up being something closer to a meditation on what it means to try to be moral in a complicated world and fail, and then try again. South Park fails at that more often than its fans want to admit, but it tries more honestly than its critics give it credit for. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave me? I still love this show. I love it with more complexity now than I did when I started this video. I love it the way you love a friend who sometimes says terrible things, but who you know, underneath it all, is trying to figure out the same things you're trying to figure out. Not always getting there, not always deserving your patience, but trying. And I think that might be enough, not as an excuse for the harm, not as a pass for the failures, but as a reason to keep watching, to keep engaging, to keep holding this show to the standard it sets for itself, which, at its best, is higher than almost any other show on television. Thank you for staying with me through all of that. I know it was a lot. I know it wasn't the most relaxing thing to listen to, but I think South Park deserves this kind of attention. The kind that doesn't just celebrate what works, but honestly confronts what doesn't. That's what Paper Town is about. That's why we're here. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Leave a comment telling me where you land on this. Tell me which side of the argument convinced you more, or if, like me, you're still somewhere in the middle, holding both threads, and not sure how to weave them together. Share this with someone who loves South Park, not to start a fight, to start a conversation. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.